Hello, Ecclesia Project. Here's my paper, and I look forward to conversation around it. Grieving an End We Created by Jonathan Tran. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John 12:24. All things end. Many things care a great deal about their end. Humans are unique in caring not only about their ends, but about the end. Non-human living creatures, including the simplest, show awareness of death, often in quite elaborate ways, and orient their lives toward it, whether by staving off death as long as possible or preparing for it. For them, life is a lifelong struggle against or preparation for death. We know of creatures that will go to great lengths to find food, fend off enemies, protect their young, doing anything and everything to stay alive. We also know of creatures who come into the world seemingly aware that they will die and spend their lives preparing for it, often by bearing offspring. All their lives, these creatures make an issue of their lives. That is, until their struggle or preparation ends with their death. Human animals make an issue of not only their individual ends, but the end as such. Non-human living things seem to take for granted that life will continue without them and seek to play their part in its continuance. They procreate expecting their kind will go on in a vast and inexhaustible present. It doesn't seem to occur to them that it might not. If they knew that Earth is coming upon its next mass extinction, they might do differently. Instead, they go on unawares, as if the world will go on forever, as if their species will remain forever in it, as if their children will have children, and their children will have children, and so on. For most of our history, we humans have been like those creatures, intuiting a future for our kind and so living toward it. No doubt there have been those among us who predicted the end, but these doomsday prophets are the exception that proves the rule. Most expect they are not only wrong, but delusional. Even religionists of various stripes portending an apocalyptic end do not really mean the end as much as a new future made possible by a short-lived end. They too think we will continue in some form or fashion. Not so much today. Today, a good many of us know there's a good chance we won't continue, that we as a species will die. And additionally, we know that if things end, we will have played a big part in their ending. Recognizing at some level that our ability to accomplish so much meant that we wanted too much for the planet to keep us for long. We are unique in these ways. All things end. Many grieve their end, just as many celebrate and fight for their lives. The current generation of humans is unique in grieving an end we created. This makes for a special kind of grief. The human capacity to make fated us to a world that could not survive all of our wants. In a few short centuries, we ruined the planet, or at least large swaths of it, taking from it life as we know it. Many have died. Many more will follow. One species destroying countless others. A creature that has been around a couple 100,000 years, wiping from the face of the earth creatures that have been around hundreds of millions of years. We are blight. We are friends and lovers, parents and children, poets and pioneers, but we are also blight. In the popular film Avengers: Infinity War, the supervillain Thanos wipes out 50% of all living things with a snap of a finger. We did so by making stuff. It took us a little longer than a finger snap to kill everything we could, but not much longer. Now it's our turn. We thought killing everything in sight would give us room to stretch our legs and live forever. We were wrong. For our miscalculation, for our inability to recognize the wild complexity of creaturely life, that we need the planet far more than it needs us, much will go on, but not us. There will be an after us, just as there was a before us. It turns out we aren't the center of the universe after all. Supposing we were, in a painful bit of poetic justice, is finally what got us. Grieving an end we created makes for a special kind of grief. Grief takes many forms, including those things humans do before beginning to grieve in earnest. Denial is one of those things, one of those forms grief takes before coming to full flower. Many are in denial about the end the innocuous term climate crisis names. And this denial has a wide range of expressions, from thinking we can save ourselves to denying we need to. We can spare ourselves the debate about what to do with deniers by remembering that denial is part of grieving. Soon enough, reality will set in. The denials will die down and people will come to terms one way or another. We should no more begrudge them their denials than begrudge the terminal patient their denials. We might think that we need to challenge their denials because their denials make it harder for us to save ourselves. But of course, that too is a form of denial. Grief takes many forms. There are two recent climate crisis books titled Learning to Die. The first, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization by Roy Scranton, began as an essay published in the New York Times, where the author wrote, quote, "The greatest challenge the Anthropocene poses isn't how the Department of Defense should plan for resource wars, whether we should put up seawalls to protect Manhattan, or when we should abandon Miami. It won't be addressed by buying a Prius, turning off the air conditioning, or signing a treaty. The greatest challenge we face is a philosophical one, understanding that this civilization is already dead. The sooner we confront our situation and realize that there is nothing we can do to save ourselves, the sooner we can get down to the difficult task of adapting with mortal humility to our new reality." End quote. Scranton himself learned to die when, as an infantry soldier, he overcame his fear of death by regularly envisioning himself dying all the ways soldiers die. Seeing himself die repeatedly freed him from the fear of dying in reality. He coaches the same for us. For Scranton, there is no question that our civilization is dying. The only question is the manner in which we will come to terms with it. He recommends the humanities, which he presents akin to liturgies that prepare people to live well by preparing them to die well. Again, quoting him. Learning to die as an individual means letting go of our predispositions and fears. Learning to die as a civilization means letting go of this particular way of life and its ideas of identity, freedom, success, and progress. These two ways of learning to die come together in the role of the humanist thinker, the one who is willing to stop and ask troublesome questions, the one who is willing to interrupt, the one who resonates on the other channels and with slower, deeper rhythms. End quote. It remains to be seen whether Scranton and people like Scranton really mean what they say when they say that living well means dying well, or whether the idea of dying well is mostly put in service of living well, a type of mind trick we play on ourselves to get ourselves to save ourselves. Robert Bringhurst and Jan Zwicky, both philosophically trained poets, make their intentions clearer in their Learning to Die. Learning to Die, Wisdom in the Age of Climate Crisis. Zwicky likens our condition to that of Socrates in Plato's dialogue, Phaedo. Socrates, one will remember, has been sentenced to death, specifically for his Scrantonian unwillingness to stop asking troublesome questions. Yet Athenian tradition has it that Socrates' execution must await the return of the ship from Delos, sent each year as a tribute to Apollos for saving the great warrior Theseus. In the meantime, Athens stays all executions, including Socrates'. Well, the ship has returned. Quoting the Phaedo from Zwicky's essay, A Ship from Delos. Socrates, why have you come so early? Crito, I bring news, Socrates, bad news. Not for you, apparently, but for me and for all your friends. Hard and grievous news. News which I myself would take to be among the most grievous. Socrates, what is it? Or has the ship from Delos, the one on whose return I must die? Has it come? Crito, it has not arrived yet, but I believe it will come today. From the reports of some men who have come from Scandion and left it then. It is clear from the messengers that it will come today, and so tomorrow, Socrates, it is necessary that your life must end. Socrates, yes, Crito, it may be for the best. If it is what the gods want, let it be. The climate crisis likewise means hard and grievous news. Indeed, the hardest, the most grievous. Zwicky writes, quote, humans collectively are now in Socrates' position. The ship with the black sails has been sighted. Catastrophic global ecological collapse is on the horizon. End quote. Zwicky thinks we are better off getting on with it so that we, like Socrates, might die well. Dying well does not mean dying without hope. Indeed, for Zwicky, hope comes as a result of dying well. Where coming to terms with death births a different kind of hope, one not bound up with the self such that one's death proves the limits of one's hope. Zwicky asks for a different hope, one that doesn't tie the future to our future, so that hope, or what turns out to be fallow hope, requires lying to ourselves. She writes, quote, to imagine that awareness of the facts precludes hope is to misconstrue both awareness and hope. To be aware that death is imminent is not to wallow in despair. It is precisely not that. To be aware is to acknowledge what is the case. What is the case for many humans, those with enough to eat and a roof over their heads, includes great beauty, the natural world, works of the human spirit and imagination, the love we feel for others and the love they feel for us. To wallow in despair that the natural world is dying is to fail to be aware that it is still, in many ways, very much alive. It is also to fail to understand that in precipitating drastic climate change and a sixth mass extinction, industrialized humans are not destroying everything. Being will be here. Beauty will be here. End quote. Zwicky encourages hope by reminding us that our end need not mean the end. She continues, quote, one form that hope takes in this situation is knowledge that the earth is prodigious. After other mass extinctions, life proliferated again. After civilizations have collapsed, others have risen. Perhaps there will be some new species with many of our talents, and fewer of our vices, end quote. In learning to die, we open ourselves to a future that isn't about us, and for once imagine the world as possessed of its own possibilities. Simone Weil said that the good of learning, whether learning geometry or learning Latin, is that learning allows a person to stop thinking about themselves for a moment, focus as they are on what they are learning. The soul empties itself of all of its own contents in order to receive into itself the being it is looking at, she writes. This feature of learning not only makes learning like prayer, but, Weil thinks, prayer the highest form of learning. Learning where the subject matter is nothing less than the infinite God. Learning to die, and consider here the Eucharistic image of Scranton regularly envisioning his death in order to liturgically learn to live well by learning to die well. Learning to die, then, can be thought of as prayer in that it helps us into the at first frightening, but finally freeing truth that it really isn't about us. It has been, after all, our inability to imagine the world without us that got us into trouble in the first place. As Bringhurst says, quote, I think it's more important than ever before that we learn to think like an ecosystem, not like a spoiled brat or a biological singularity. One reason is so we can go down singing, happy to know what we know, hopeful that the earth will go on living its life to the full as long as it can. The other reason is so that we as individuals and small groups with limited resources can do what is possible to do on the world's behalf, on being's behalf, and therefore on ours, end quote. Humans seem set on believing that life is all about them, presuming that the whole world exists for our benefit, and that without us managing things, there would be no world. These two beliefs come really to just one. We manage the world for our benefit. If not for us, there's no point. This folly helps explain why responses to climate crisis tends to take two dominant forms: hoarding what we can while we can, or destroying the planet in order to save it. We might rather remember that the world will go on without us, and that our dying off contributes to its going on, just as prior mass extinctions created the conditions that brought about our existence. For Bringhorst and Zwicky, remembering as much is how hope intertwines with grief. One might object that all this learning to die talk will lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, exactly the thing we don't need if we hope to mobilize one another to save all that can be saved. Telling people the end is guaranteed only guarantees that end, when in fact, nothing is yet decided. We still have time, and let's not waste it with self-fulfilling talk about learning to die. At the end of their learning to die, Bringhurst and Zwicky anticipate the objection with an afterword on optimism and pessimism. There they take on the famed Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker's enlightenment-based optimism that paints a far rosier picture, which includes what Pinker takes as arguments from science that the climate crisis is actually going in the other direction, getting better rather than worse, and that we humans have ourselves to thank for it. Bringhurst and Zwicky make quick work of Pinker's optimism, or so they think. Readers will have to decide for themselves. I obviously think they are more right than wrong. Bringhorst and Zwicky show how on the science, Pinker is wrong everywhere he thinks he is right. Rather than denial that only hastens our demise, we are better off learning to die so that we might die well, going down singing, as Bringhurst says. Regarding the question of optimism, pessimism, and self-fulfilling prophecies, there's fierce debate within the scientific community about what to say to the public. Back when experts thought the Earth could mostly withstand a 1.5-degree increase in global temperatures, they rallied the world governments around it. Experts now expect that even a 1.5-degree increase would be devastating. But they're not sure what to say, because the reality is that the world is well on its way to a 3 and even 4-degree increase, which experts expect will be disastrous. Should scientists stick with the 1.5, since at least we've gotten people to commit to that, hoping that something between 1.5 and 3.0 is better than 3.0 and 4.0, hoping that devastating is better than disastrous? These calculations are made knowing full well that disastrous regards the whole world, while devastating regards mostly those parts of the world without the power and privilege to survive devastating. The difference between devastation and disaster is the difference between rich and poor, a difference only the rich will be able to appreciate. For the poor, whose poverty makes any more devastation already impossible, it will all be disastrous. But that's always been the case. Part of what is at stake in this question about what to tell the public is the issue about what matters about the human life. On the one hand, it is obvious that what matters for people is what affects their lives. People care about things like food, safety, friendship, etc., because they believe their lives are better with those things than without them, and they are right to believe that. There are questions about how much those things should matter, just as there are questions about how food, safety, friendship, etc. relates to goodness, truth, and beauty. But no one doubts that they matter and should, in some serious sense, matter. They matter because they matter to us. On the other hand, are there things that matter to us beyond their mattering to us? The philosopher Samuel Scheffler thinks that things beyond us do indeed matter to us. He asks us to imagine doomsday scenarios where human life suddenly and slowly ends. In each case, he thinks the thought experiment greatly upsets us, both for the prospect of our own respective lives coming to an end and for the prospect of human life coming to an end. He shows through the counterfactual scenarios that for most of us, life matters to us beyond us, such that the thought of it ending after our deaths, greatly upsets us. We are not so self-absorbed, Scheffler thinks, that we do not care whether our individual deaths. We are not so self-absorbed, Scheffler thinks, that we do not care whether after our individual deaths, life goes on, something he cleverly calls the afterlife. We surely hope it does. And the idea of the afterlife brings us great comfort, believing that life will continue for others, even as it ends for us. Grieving, then, not just our ends, but the end, brings with it an entirely different kind of grief than we're used to. Our grief, the usual kind regarding the loss of this or that person, even one's own person, presumes Scheffler's afterlife, that life will go on after you. Expectation of the afterlife gives us hope that projects we committed to before we died will be carried on by others and even possibly fulfilled by them. The afterlife also allows our individual lives to matter insofar as they matter to those who will remember us. And the knowledge that we have contributed to the continuation of the species Homo sapien, if only by living at some point during its tenure, gives our lives a sense of meaning and purpose. The thought, therefore, that everything would end, suddenly or slowly, that there would be no people to continue or to remember, that there would be no afterlife, proves greatly upsetting. Another philosopher, Another philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, thinks that Scheffler underestimates how much our lives matter irrespective of the afterlife, that our lives matter to us in and of themselves, and that we, for example, take on projects not only to complete them, but also because we find them intrinsically worthwhile. Frankfurt might be right about this, but it's also the case, to Scheffler's larger point, that the goodness of our lives, their intrinsic value, would feel different if we knew it was all going to end. Intrinsic goods may be intrinsically good, but pairing them with serious losses makes of them something different. In one of the most profound reflections on loss and grief I know of, the HBO series The Leftovers, based on the Tom Perrotta novel, 2% of the world's population suddenly and inexplicably disappears. In one harrowing scene, the ultrasound image of a baby in utero suddenly goes empty. The world comes crashing down in a horror people in the show refer to as the departure. The Leftovers begins 3 years after the departure. The show's drama turns not on the question of what happened, but on how people handle what happened, raising the questions: how does one live among ruins in a world that is broken and without any hope of reconstruction? What is the vital status of those who live, or rather survive, in areas of existence where life is inconceivable? There are many after the departure who move on or want to move on. It isn't the case that these people move on because the losses don't devastate them. Just the opposite. The losses prove so devastating that the only thing they can do is move on, or again, try to. Then there are those who call themselves the guilty remnant. These people not only refuse to move on, but refuse to let others move on. They, quote, had one essential mission. It was to resist the so-called return to normalcy, the day-to-day process of forgetting the rapture, or at the very least of consigning it to the past, treating it as a part of the ongoing fabric of human history, rather than the cataclysm that had brought history to an end, end quote. They torment and terrorize others by constantly reminding them of what they lost. At one point, they sneak into people's homes and stage replicas with remarkable likenesses to their departed loved ones, in exactly those places they were when they departed. It is a shocking, horrific scene. But no less shocking and horrific, the guilty remnant thinks, than trying to move on. What is more shocking and horrific, avoiding or acknowledging that the end has come? Grief is a function of love. One grieves the loss of one's loves. No wonder then that people avoid grief, for to grieve is to acknowledge that something you love, like your baby, was there and is now gone forever. What would it mean to acknowledge such loss? Who could survive it? While The Leftovers doesn't linger on the question of what caused the departure, there's surely a sense haunting the story that it is somehow our fault, that we created the conditions that led to it. Whether the conditions were environmental ones like, say, sea level rise or mechanized farming, the show doesn't say. It simply leaves us to deal with the possibility that we created the departure, that the loss of 2% of the world's population, about 160 million people, is our fault, which would make the return to normalcy or the guilty remnant but two sides of a nihilism consigned to people who did this to themselves. Upon realizing that his mistake led to his children's deaths, the main character in Manchester by the Sea grabs a cop's gun and tries to kill himself. Perhaps acknowledgement and avoidance are like that when it comes to climate crisis. Killing yourself because you can't bear the fact that you've killed your children. Ending the misery of not only what you've done, but the fact that you did it. At least Socrates had the solace of knowing that his death was unjust, that no matter what, he didn't deserve it. No such solace awaits us. We as a society now face an existential question. Not about existence per se, where the fate of Homo sapiens is all but certain, but about how the demise of our species will be handled. One approach will be to further extract from the earth what we want. No longer just to live bigger and better, but increasingly to live it all. To get this from a planet increasingly unable to give it, and in fact long resistant to it, we will instinctively turn to the playbook that first got us into this mess. That is, we will disregard the world we found and make it into the world we need or think we need. This requires brutal violence as we reshape baseline realities into blank slates and then make of things what we will. More precisely, this requires more brutal violence, since our behaving in brutally violent ways has long been the case. The brutality will intensify, though, since the death match we have locked ourselves into with planet Earth means that we will have to push further, harder, and more violently. As the Earth pushes back and we face the repercussions of its unwillingness, we will suffer more and grow more desperate, only further intensifying our pushing and desperation. The alternative is to hear the lessons Earth has been speaking to us, which requires learning its language in order to hear its message. The Roman Catholic theologian Matthew Whalen speaks of agroecology as a science, politics, and theology receptive of the grammar of creation. He writes, quote, while industrial agriculture, as we have seen, regards the world as a blank page, agroecology closely attends to what is already written, and its practice collaborates with the possibilities offered by things themselves and what the locale itself permits. Agroecology receives the world as if it possesses a kind of intelligibility and goodness that should be acknowledged, respected, and cooperated in the use of it. Relatedly, agroecologists rely upon the ecological grammar to do crucial normative work, such as to evaluate agroecosystems and their relative degradation and ecological integrity, to articulate problems with patterning agriculture upon industry, and to advocate for modeling agriculture upon ecology. In this manner, agroecology's ecological grammar is caught up in a form of moral reasoning that converges with Catholic social teachings' natural law ethic. End quote. We have managed the world like a factory, holding it to what agroecologists call an industrial standard, and Whalen calls us back to imagining the world differently. Back because in turning to the world, we turn back to ourselves. And Whalen's reference to natural law harkens to a full-bodied hermeneutic of relating to the wisdom the world offers as morally weighted, as the world saying something about itself as God's, and in ways that make claims on us. Rather than seeing the world as a blank slate to be made into whatever one wishes, agroecologists imagine the world in possession of its own life, in which we play small, but, as with any part of a whole, important role. Central to the agroecologist method and directly contrasting our ongoing industrialized methods is the notion that the world comes with wisdom for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Wisdom that allows for lushly complex relationships that can care for human needs so long as that wisdom is heeded and practiced. All the world's creatures adhere to this wisdom, intuiting it by nature, except those who think they've outsmarted it and squander the world's lessons. Respect the world's wisdom, and she will return to you what you need. Disrespect that wisdom, and for a time you may get away with undermining the world's natural grammars, but eventually she will speak the truth of things. One lesson the world badly wants to teach us, according to Whalen's agroecology, relates to death. Quote, all the ecosystemic processes that agroecologists manage, not just predatory prey dynamics, but also soil fertility, nutrient and biomass cycling, and so on. All of these essentially involve the management of creaturely death as a constitutive and productive feature of agrosystems. End quote. Whalen speaks of the gift of death as a way of envisioning creaturely death as participating in, rather than absconding from, the life of God. One of the ways creatures participate with God insofar as they participate with the God of Jesus Christ. Whalen writes, quote, our forms of provisioning for ourselves and for one another cannot be disentangled from the death of other creatures, whether they be microorganisms, insects, plants, or other animals. The right response to this reality is to acknowledge it and even give thanks to the God who brings good even out of evil. For it is a reality in which we glimpse, even if it is through a glass darkly, the Paschal mystery of Christ, the death that conquers death, and that continues to give life to the whole world. End quote. Whalen goes into keener detail still. Quote, the groaning of creation is the existence of predators like wolves, leopards, and lions whose teeth and claws are soaked in the blood of their prey. Agroecology points us to the quieter, more hidden forms of death that constitute and sustain creaturely life in this world. While fields like agroecology attend to such empirical realities, one need not be an agroecologist to see them. Anyone who considers closely the soil of a well-functioning agro-ecosystem will notice that it is a graveyard, a site of countless creaturely deaths, as well as lives and ecological processes arising from them. Death is constitutive to the soil's fertility and its ability to support diverse creaturely life. These deaths, moreover, are embedded in and enable the very balance, order, equilibria, and harmony about which social teaching speaks. It is not just that there is death and predation in nature, but that there is no nature as we know it without such death and predation. End quote. Learning to die involves embracing a key agroecological principle. It is okay to die, for death is part of being in this world. Therefore, Whalen says, our choice then is not whether to depend on death, but how. End quote. Posturing human life in relationship to climate crisis as one where we grieve an end we created helps us imagine human beings more fully integrated into the divine economy. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. Scripture tells the story as one in which by sin we contribute to our own demise, casting the human part of the story as not only vocationally tilling and keeping the earth, as Whalen puts it, but also of acting against that vocation. Much of the story involves the undue damage humans do to the world. Later in the story, where we stand now, the story turns to our collective death as we are cycled back into a planetary system we were foolish enough to think we stood above. Jesus puts it in directly agrarian terms. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Dying better than we lived entails giving ourselves to the death we made as part of creation's larger scheme, where death is part of the creature's natural progression through the world. David Abram, to whom is credited first talking about the more than human world, portrays death as part of a process that sees the cycling of the human back into the larger world, as each remains as an animating force within the vastness of the landscape. For Abram, recognizing death in these terms presents another mode of attentiveness to non-human nature, readily available, according to Abram, except those places where Christianity disembodies the soul. This nature signifies not so much an awe or reverence of human powers, but rather a reverence for those forms that awareness takes when it is not in human form, when the familiar human embodiment dies and decays and becomes part of an encompassing cosmos. It may be for the best. If it is what the gods want, let it be. Last summer, the heat killed our family chickens. It was the second in a row for Central Texas of brutally hot summers, with temperatures well into the triple digits for weeks on end, and evenings bringing the barest of relief. People in Waco joked, well, on the one hand, it's the hottest summer we've had in 100 years. On the other, it's the coolest we'll have in 100 years. It was one of those dark attempts at humor people try on when the only way to laugh is to turn a sad truth into a funny one. We tried everything to cool the chickens, installing fans, running a misting system, even regularly dunking them in cold water. But they died, the last two on the same day. Melisandre, the younger one, died first, sending the older one, Aria, into a panic as she tried to revive Melisandre by frantically brooding atop her dead body. As the heat overtook her, we put Aria in ice water as a last resort. But the damage was done, her internal organs failing due to heat stroke. Many thousands of farm animals died that summer, Melisandre and Aria among them. Over the years, whenever any of them died, we buried our chickens behind the coop. But we noticed that predators would soon sniff them out and dig them up, leaving holes and animal parts strewn about the yard, as if the earth were protesting our society's insulated approach to death and sought to reclaim itself. This time, I carried Aria out and laid her on the ground near a small wood, not far from where I left Melisandre. What might it mean to imagine the earth similarly receiving back the human now at its collective end? The planet carrying us out to the dust from which we began and now return. In the final analysis, creation might not fault us our fate so much as view us dying the kinds of creatures we were, ones whose abilities fated them to doing and wanting too much. This image of the human animal returned to the vast landscape would betoken a story where a human is carried to a tree and cycled back into the Trinitarian ground of love. This would return the notion of the afterlife from Scheffler's Life Without Us to Christianity's God With Us, making Vey's frightening truth that it isn't about us indeed freeing, not to do nothing, but rather to do anything, including going down singing. Thanks, and I look forward to the conversation.